Hi, welcome to Ian Wallace, the Messed Up Counsellor. Um, Today, what I'd like to talk about is growing through the pain of teenage years, which is never a comfortable experience. Um, I'm going to use some reference to my teenage years, which I can remember for the ones that are looking at me and going, "How do you remember when you were a teenager?" It's only 50 years ago. I have a good memory. Although it's obviously slightly different experience to teenagers nowadays with all the tech and all the kind of electronic stuff that we have. Um, but when we're looking at our process of growing up, the teenage years are really awkward for everybody. It doesn't matter what time zone you come from. It was for me when I was a teenager. Teenager for me, though, is about the 12-year-old, and teenager now tends to be about a 6-year-old. So, no, I'm only kidding. No, I'm not. So that 6-year-old. So the process of growing in the first few years of our lives, and usually up to about the age of 10, we get given the world. We're not born with the world, we're given the world. So our process of being given the world, we're given somebody else's world. Quite naturally, their world is our world. So normally when we're younger, although nowadays we tend to challenge that at a younger age, and I think that's something to do with how we look at children growing up and the kind of stimulation we give them, the kind of way we ask them to question their world. Because when I was growing up, unfortunately, you never questioned a parent's world, ever. They're just not on. You were seen and not heard kind of process. And that's a lot different nowadays. And that's a good thing, obviously, because kids need to be looking at their world and examining it in some way, shape, or form and kind of reviewing it and challenging it. So when we're growing up, our process of being given the world at some point when we're old enough to kind of define these things, and that's a different age for most people. There's not a age when you're a teenager, I don't think. It's looked upon after 10, but some people are very old, young people, and some people are very young, old people. So it's not an age thing necessarily. It's an experiential thing when we do this. But we challenge that world, and that's a healthy thing to do. It doesn't necessarily become an easy process, but we do challenge it. Now, if we're challenging it at the same time as our other parts of our world are changing, such as puberty, for example, when our bodies are changing massively and our kind of gender and identity and sexuality start emerging with those processes, then lots and lots of changes are happening at the same time. So when we challenge the world that we've been given, then that can create conflict, because the people who gave us the world, our parental models, don't have to be biological parents. It can be grandparents, it can be teachers, it can be anybody that we trust and we feel comfortable with. That world is given to us, and then we challenge it. We challenge it because we want to create our world, whatever that looks like. Now, our world will usually not be vastly different from the world that we've been given, as long as what we've been given is respectful and valuing and all the good things about parenting. We will then challenge that world with our own ideas, our own views. And that process of challenging starts or can start to create conflict, because the people who gave us that world, they like their world. This is the world. This is how I like my world to be. Then as we challenge that world, then it kind of rocks the boat a bit. And we sometimes hold on to our world. As a parent, we hold on to our world. I say, no, this is the world. We don't want any different world. And that process of challenging the world creates this conflict. Now, that normally doesn't produce a massive change. It kind of modifies the world, if you like. We take the original world, if you like, and then we put on our world and we modify the world. So then we take forward a modified version of that world. which sometimes will initially be a bit traumatic with the family dynamics, but then it sometimes quietens down. The parental figures or the elders can allow that change, that modification, and it kind of like settles, to being okay. Yeah, well, that's what they do. We didn't do it that way, but it's not dangerous, and it's okay. And that process of conversation helps us to understand the modified world, why they want to change it, obviously, but it also makes us aware of our world. And sometimes that world, the modified world, can be helpful to us as well. It can bring us new experiences, new ideas, a bit more diversity and difference, possibly. So it kind of creates that. But sometimes some human beings feel very insecure with those changes, and then they will react to those changes, and that might not be helpful, because that conflict that can be created would possibly become destructive. So when you're a parent or a teenager, you kind of have to think about each other's world. You kind of have to wonder about what it is their world needs to be different for. What is that difference? What is that diversity? And is it something that really, is it a big deal? If they want to be a goth, for example, or in my world, my age, a punk, yeah. Is it such a big deal? Is it anything other than some different clothing, or a different group, or different ideas? Does it massively make any difference to our world, that process? So in order to understand, we have to have a conversation with that teenager, that young person, and we have to share ideas. We have to say, okay, yeah, why do you want to do that? What is it you get from that? Instead of saying, you're not doing that, And I say, when I grew up as a teenager, we weren't really allowed to have an identity until we sometimes left home, to be fair. You get statements like, well, if you don't toe the line, you're out. Literally, you aren't living here anymore. There would be serious physical consequences sometimes to being different. The belt and things were commonly used, and certainly commonly used with me, as a way of bringing harmony. Not really. Of towing the line, of saying my way is the only way, you can't do anything different, and if you do, you're going to get this belt across your bum, or other places. So that process wasn't healthy for me, because it produced violence, and violence is never healthy, ever. And nowadays, obviously, we try, and it is in a sense illegal, to chastise our children in a violent sense, as punishment, which is a good thing, obviously. So that process means that I grew up with this much more dramatic change when I was 11, 12, 13. And I started, as a lot of people do, I started acting out those things. And some of the things I'm not proud about, to be fair, looking back. And they were done because I was trying to burst out of this bubble, call it that, of restrictions, of how the world should be, how I should be in the world. And trying to burst out of that bubble made it very hard to do it in a slow, easy, controlled way. I had to do it in an explosive way. And that explosion, as I say, was not always helpful to me as well as other people around me. But then it gave me something. It gave me, as I'm growing up, a process of not wanting to be one of the crowd. And I'll give you an example of that. So when I'm 14, 15, somewhere on there, there was a thing called Mods and Rockers, which if you look back into the Who and those kind of groups, Tommy, all these kind of things, those were going on when I was that age. And they were a big influence on a lot of people. So there was kind of like two groups. There was kind of like the Mods, which is the people who used to ride around on Lambrettas and Vespers and scooters, and the rockers, which would ride around on motorbikes. So those are the two predominant camps as I'm growing up. And so when I get to a point where I've got some money, earning paper round and buying things, I bought myself a fishtail parka. So a fishtail parka is an overcoat. It's a very warm overcoat with a hood. It's green usually, or camouflaged, and it kind of like wraps around and it's nice and warm when it's cold in winter. And at the back, it's got a triangular piece that comes down to a point, which is why they call it a fishtail. So I buy this fishtail parka. Now, the mods at the time, who were wearing parkas, all wore parkas that were very, very similar. They were all straight cut across the bottom at the back. They didn't have this fishtail process. And the rockers were obviously wearing leathers and those kind of things. So it changed with that film, The Who and Tommy. And the process then, everybody wanted fishtail parkas. Now, my growing up process was one to be an individual. I was going to be my own person, the conflict. It's interesting now as I'm a granddad, I kind of like look back at some of those values, not the chastising and the violent ones, obviously, but that structure, and it becomes much more able to be balanced as a process of being a grandparent. But anyhow, I digress. So this fishtail parka that I had, and everybody started buying them. So me, being me, which I sold my fishtail parka to somebody who wanted a fishtail parka for probably twice the amount I paid for it. Good investment. And I bought a straight bottom parka, which everybody was getting rid of. And so I got one for next to nothing. That wasn't the fashion. They were all going to fishtail parkas. But the reason why I say this is because as a teenager, growing up and modifying the world and getting my own world, that explosion made me not want to be one of the crowd. And it gave me an individuality. It gave me a process of I'm fine on my own. I'm okay with what I do and how I do what I do. And my own style, if you like, of clothing. And I don't necessarily conform to labels or those kind of things. I think that's given me a lot of help over the years, in a sense that I don't feel that odd one out process. I feel comfortable being the odd one out. And I don't do the goth thing and the punk thing. I didn't do those things in those days because I don't like pain and don't want to stick safety pins through my lip. But that's another process. And I don't like wearing makeup. So I wouldn't do a goth thing, because I'm not into that. It's not my world. I don't mind people who do. I'm quite happy with the people around nowadays. I don't take any judgment about it. It's just not what I do, personally. So that process of growing up, that process of the teenage years, where you are, if you're watching this, and obviously if you are, you won't know what I'm talking about. That's interesting. So the teenager, they will have a completely different idea of what that experience looks like. The parental influences will also have a completely different idea of what that looks like. And when we're growing through that coming to terms with all the changes that are occurring, and certainly when I work with young people and families with young people at this kind of age, then it's massively hard, probably harder these days for teenagers than it was in my day. And it was hard enough in my day. It's certainly if those changes are occurring around puberty and that 12-year-old time, we don't necessarily look at it from the point of the massive insecurity that kids have in those years. They're trying to fit into a world. They're trying to understand a world that is completely different to how I was when I was that age. I don't have those experiential situations that I can take to understand it. It is alien to me in a sense. So as we're trying to go through those processes nowadays from any parents watching, then just think that you were a teenager at one time. You had this explosion. You did want to modify your world and have your own identity. You've been through that process. Not the same way. No, it will be different. But you've been through it and you've experienced it. And that process of going through it might make it very easy for you to not necessarily understand this young person that you're the parental influence of, but you might very much understand that it is a process that you have to go through. So when you went through your process of being a teenager, it will be different, as I've said. And you can use that as some guide, but don't think it's going to be the same, because it will not be the same. The modifying the world and being myself and being how I want to be with my identity will be the same. But what that identity is will not be the same, because the restrictions you had as a parent will not be the same as these young people have nowadays. There will be different restrictions. There'll be restrictions, but they'll be different. So when you see your teenager growing up, then it's really helpful. And I do this with groups of parents trying to understand teenagers. Really helpful to look back on your teenage years, which is sometimes hard to remember, I know. But look back on them and see how you went through that process. And it will give you an indicator. There'll be some similarities. There'll be some situations, dynamics that are the same. That might help you to be less confrontational. It might help you to try to understand more their process. Because if you look at your growing up teenage years and how your parents reacted to that, then that might give you some ideas of what not to do in this process. And it might give you some ideas of what to do, obviously. From a teenager's point of view, the world is massively different. Even for parents who are kind of like, mid-20s, 30s. That pressure that they feel now is massively different to what certainly I felt. I felt different pressures, but not the same. Certainly not media and media presentations and the things that happens through media. Everything is much faster nowadays. Everything is much more intense. So not only are they going through that process of modifying the world that I've talked about, fishtail packers, they're also going through puberty. Their body is changing. They have no control over that. It's like the body's not mine. It's doing all this stuff. Bodies are growing, developing, changing. The brain is massively changing through those periods, and a lot more intensity of growth, of knowledge, of widening their understanding. So there's a lot of growth. There's also a process of that intense pressure that kids feel now about trying to understand what they're going to do in later life. What do you want for your qualifications? What kind of things do you want to study? Those kind of things at 14-ish, they're not necessarily always helpful in trying to understand, this is the moment of making your choice. I don't think I made my choice till I was 40. I didn't know what I wanted to do till I was 40-ish. And I don't think many people do. I don't think many people have an idea of what they want to do when they get older, until they get to it. And then they find it. And hopefully it fits, as it did with me, doing the counselling and the kind of therapy and the training work. So they're going through this process of change, but changing on many, many different fronts. Their body, their mind, their process of trying to define what the future should look like, what their choices they have to make. They're going through a whole different range of sexual identities, sexual feelings, emotions, which are massively scary for a lot of people. They don't just happen. There's a lot of worry, concern, feeling at odds with themselves as these things change, as our ideas change, our understanding changes, as we grow, as we experience things. We find out what we like, what we don't like. That process of, connecting to other people who are going through all these changes usually, and everybody's kind of moving around. There's a lot of insecurity, a lot of worry, a lot of concern. And although they don't necessarily talk about it, which is unhelpful, to be fair, and I think they don't talk when they tell me these things, not because they don't want to talk, but because they don't understand themselves either. So if you ask them a question, it's well, why are you doing that? What's all that about? And it's like, no idea. And they generally don't have any idea of why these things are occurring. These things are just changing, certainly from a body point of view. And when I'm working with parents, they use derogatory statements about this process, which is not helpful, really isn't. They'll say things like, well, you're just a lazy devil. Well, actually, no, they're not. They're not lazy. Their body is going through all these changes. They're growing phenomenally. Can you imagine how much energy it takes to grow a bone, lengthen a bone, lengthen tendons, create different neural pathways? How much energy is used in order to do that? We never think about those things usually. So no, it's not that they're lazy. They're actually tired out. Their body is growing. Their mind is growing. All these things are happening. The stresses, the processes of fitting in, whatever that looks like, or being yourself, whatever that looks like. All that is energy that is being used to make it happen. So, they're just tired. That's why they get up at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Sometimes. That's why they raid the fridge, feeding themselves to get this energy so that their body can grow. Now, we don't think of those things generally. We just see the disturbance. We just see this derogatory sense, you're lazy. You're lazy, good for nothing, was something I was always told when I was a teenager. I wasn't lazy. I just didn't have any energy. And I was tired. That stands to reason for me now, looking back. And if you can think of it in these kind of ways, that, if you're a teenager watching this, then don't think of yourself as bad or wrong for doing this process of change, this process of growing in all sorts of different ways. You won't understand it all the time. You'll be experiencing something that is happening to you most of the time. It's not happening by you. It's like your body and your mind is kind of like attacking you, in a sense, to try and grow, develop, become. The thirst for knowledge in those years is massive, but that knowledge uses energy to create those neural pathways, those memories, those ideas. It's all energy. And so how can you have energy to do things when all that energy being used to grow, develop, become? So try as parents not to use derogatory statements, not to put those people down. Make them aware that they're respected and valued. Try to understand why they're doing what they're doing. They don't get it. They don't understand it most of the time. But at least if they have conversations with you, open ones, open dialogue with you, then at least you can try and sort it out together. And you can both become aware of this process of change. If you can do that, and when I've worked with young people where those have been options, either working with the parents to understand these kind of processes and checking back and seeing their processes, or working with the young people going through these processes, if we can start to understand each other instead of reacting to each other, then you'll go a long, long way to getting this solved and building those relationships much stronger in the future, because that young person will feel valued and respected by having their ideas, their input asked and communicated and talked about and held and supported. That will be a massive thing for them, because that process will help them to understand that they're not wrong. It's not wrong, this is just a developmental process going through. Don't react to the behaviour. Have a conversation about it. Don't chastise it, unless it's unsafe, obviously. Then there's a different process. But if it's not unsafe, don't do that process. Don't do that idea of they're wrong, they're bad, they're not doing what they should be doing. Because kind of you didn't when you were teenagers. And if you look back, you'll probably see some similarities. Certainly of challenging the world. That will always be there in some way, shape or form. Most young people just want to be accepted. They want to be understood. They want to be accepted. They want to be valued. And if we show them respect, they will then respect us back. And then you can have this experience of connection, of understanding. A long time ago, I was working with a young person who had been presented to me by, usually parents present children and young people, and they tell, can you sort our child out or our young person? We very rarely find it's the young person that's the problem, to be fair. It's usually their situation, scenario, the stuff that's going around. And this young person was becoming very, very anxious. And it was a new thing, a different thing. It'd been shown new, but there was some history with the anxiety, which I understood. And obviously I won't give you the details because of confidentiality. But they were anxious, and so they were presented to me, and I worked with this young person. And initially they didn't understand what was going on, obviously, as a young person. But when we started talking, sharing, when they got to trust me, because of that respect and valuing, non-judgmental, non-biased process that we do as counsellors, then they opened up and we explored the aspect of anxiety and where it was occurring and how, when it started, and those kind of things. There's 3 questions that I said in a previous podcast. So that process made me realise that this young person was anxious because his dad, heterosexual couple, his dad was sleeping downstairs. Now, nobody had ever asked the question as to why your anxiety. They just saw the behaviour of anxiousness. So we started exploring that. So, well, why does that make you anxious? Because they're going to get a divorce. Because they're going to split up. Because I'm worried about them. And then we started working with that. And we looked at the perception, reality process to see if it was real. And those concerns, those worries, I created in the family process with the young person's, obviously, approval. And I saw the parents, the mum and dad. And I raised these possibilities of how it started. And they gave me a completely different story to the young person. They said, no, we're not splitting up. We're not doing that. The mum, unfortunately, was having problems sleeping because the father was snoring. And the father had to be the mother had to be kind of up early in the morning. So from that point of view, they'd slept in different places. There wasn't a spare bedroom, so the only place to sleep was downstairs until they could get something sorted to give them some respite. So it wasn't that they were splitting up. It wasn't that they were disconnecting. It was the fact that I just can't get any sleep. So your dad's sleeping downstairs. Now, once that had been discussed in the family process, the young person's anxiety went away. It's one indicator of communication, of connection. Understand why people are doing what we're doing is much, much, much more important than what they do, which is why I wrote the book. Why do they do that? And what do we do about it? Because that format helps to bring people closer, helps to understand people and create a harmony in those relationships. because we all react and we all have behavioural reactions, which are not necessarily what it's all about. So look behind of that, look underneath of that, look at the why of that, and you're much more likely to solve it. Hopefully that was interesting, and thanks for listening and watching this podcast. My name's Ian Wallace. I'm the Messed Up Counsellor. Share this, like this for other people, because you never know what they're going through. People very rarely don't tell you the problems they're having. And just by sharing it, maybe you will help another teenager or parent understand this complex, and it is complex, process of growing up. Take care. Look after yourselves.